history is not always what happened. Often, history is simply what we expect to have happened. We look at the past through a mirror, but that mirror is cracked. It reflects our own prejudices, our own rules, and our own limitations back at us. For 130 years, the world looked at a specific grave in Sweden and saw a king. We saw the swords. We saw the shields. We saw the sacrificed horses, their bones interlocked in a final display of wealth and power. We looked at the skeleton lying in the center of it all, and we said, "Here lies a mighty man, a commander of armies, a paragon of the Viking alpha male." Textbooks were written about him. Museums built replicas of him. He became the archetype, the standard by which all other Viking warriors were measured. There was just one problem, one tiny, microscopic detail that lay hidden inside the marrow of those ancient bones. A secret that waited in the silence of the earth for 10 centuries. In 2017, science finally asked the question that history was too afraid to ask. They took a sample, they ran the sequence, and the results shook the foundations of the archaeological world. The king was a queen, the warlord was a woman. This is the story of Grave BJ581. This is the story of how we got it wrong. And this is the true story of the Shield Maiden who proved that the battlefield has no gender. Welcome to the Viking Saga. Chapter 1. The Silent Grov2. Understand the shock. We must first understand the perfection of the discovery. We need to travel back to the year 1878. The Victorian era. An age of industry, of empire, and of rigid gender roles. Men worked, fought, and ruled. Women raised children, wove cloth, and waited in Sweden. An entomologist turned archaeologist named Hjalmar Stolt was digging on the island of Björk. This island was the site of Birka, one of the most important trading centers of the Viking Age, a hub where silver and slaves flowed between the east and the west. Stope had dug up hundreds of graves. Most were simple. Some burnt bones, a clay pot, maybe a comb. But then, he found it. He marked it in his notebook as BJ581. As his team brushed away the dirt, they realized this was not a farmer. This was not a merchant. This was a professional killer of the highest order. The body was seated, not laid flat, suggesting a position of alertness even in death. And the inventory of weapons was staggering. On the left side lay a double-edged sword, a masterpiece of steel. On the right, a heavy Siksa fighting knife used for close-quarters butchery. Above the head, 2 shields. By the side, a quiver of armor-piercing arrows. And at the feet, the skeletons of 2 horses. 1 mare, 1 stallion. Both sacrificed to carry their master into Valhalla, for Stoppe. And for every historian who looked at the drawings for the next century, the conclusion was automatic. It was instant. This is a high-ranking officer. This is a man who led troops. Why did they assume this? Because in 1880, the idea of a woman holding a sword was considered fantasy. It was the stuff of Wagnerian opera, of myths about Valkyries flying over battlefields. It wasn't real. Biology, they argued, was destiny. Women were smaller, weaker. Their hips were made for birthing, not for the shield wall. So, for decades, BJ581 became the ultimate Viking man. When illustrators wanted to draw a Viking warlord for a book, they used this grave as the model. When experts talked about Viking strategy, they pointed to this grave. The skeleton was put on display in museums. The placard read, "The Birka Warrior," and the pronoun used was always he. But the skeleton was trying to tell us something. Looking back now, the clues were there. The bones were slender. The jaw was not heavy. But the artifacts were so loudly masculine, the swords, the spears, that they drowned out the whisper of the biology. We saw the weapons, and we stopped looking at the person. We let the iron tell the story instead of the bone. But silence does not last forever. In the 1970s, a new wave of osteologists, bone specialists, started to look again. They looked at the pelvic bone. They looked at the mandible. And they started to whisper a dangerous question in the back rooms of universities. Are we sure? But the establishment wasn't ready to listen. Not yet. It would take another 40 years, and a technology that Hjalmar Stolp could never have imagined, to finally unlock the tomb. The era of assumptions was ending. The era of genetics was about to begin. Chapter 2. The perfect WROD. To understand the magnitude of the mistake, we must look closer at the grave itself. BJ581 was not just a hole in the ground. It was a statement. In the Viking world, how you were buried told the world who you were. And this grave was screaming power. Of the 1,100 graves excavated at Birka, this was one of the most elaborate. It was located on a terraced slope, directly overlooking the garrison and the hall of the warriors. Position matters. Even in death, this person was watching over the troops. This was not a coincidence. It was strategic geography, but it was the contents of the grave that truly cemented the legend. We found a full set of gaming pieces, a complete board for Hnefatov, the Viking equivalent of chess. This is a crucial detail that is often overlooked. A simple foot soldier does not play chess. A berserker consumed by rage does not play chess. A game board is the tool of a tactician. It represents strategic thinking, the ability to maneuver troops, the mind of a commander. The presence of these pieces signaled to archaeologists that this person wasn't just a fighter. They were a leader. They made decisions that determined who lived and who died. Then there were the weapons. The sword was not a rusted piece of iron. It was a high-quality blade, likely imported, signifying immense wealth. The arrows were armor-piercing, designed to punch through chest. The shields were positioned to protect the body eternally. And the horses, a mare and a stallion, were connected to the grave by bridles, ready to be ridden into the afterlife. Every single artifact pointed to one conclusion. This was the ultimate Viking warlord. The archetype. The gold standard. For over a century, if you wanted to know what a Viking officer looked like, you looked at BJ581. The skeleton was the physical embodiment of the warrior myth. And because the myth of the warrior was exclusively male, the skeleton had to be male. It fit the narrative so perfectly that no one bothered to check the facts. The grave was too good to be questioned. Asterisk, asterisk, so why did it take nearly 140 years to realize the truth? The answer lies not in the ground, but in our own heads. We often think of science as objective, as a pursuit of pure truth. But archaeology is interpreted by people, and people are products of their time. When Hjalmar Stolp excavated Birka in the late 19th century, Europe was deep in the Victorian era. This was a time of rigid, suffocating gender roles. The world was divided into two neat boxes. Men were the public figures, the soldiers, the politicians, the workers. They belonged in the sphere of action. Women were the domestic figures, the mothers, the wives, the keepers of the hearth. They belonged in the sphere of the home. When these Victorian historians looked back at the Vikings, they projected their own reality onto the past. They assumed the Vikings followed the same rules. They saw a sword, and their brains said man. They saw a necklace, and their brains said woman. It was a binary system. There was no room for nuance. There were other graves in Birka that contained weapons and female skeletons, but they were dismissed. The historians came up with elaborate excuses. They said, oh, the weapons must be heirlooms from her husband, or maybe the weapons were just symbolic. They performed mental gymnastics to avoid the obvious conclusion. But with BJ581, they couldn't dismiss it. The weapons were clearly hers. The horses were hers. The game board was hers. So, instead of accepting that a woman could be a warrior, they simply decided the skeleton was a man. They didn't look at the pelvis shape. They didn't measure the bone density. They decided the sex based on the metal, not the biology. This is what we call the iron ceiling of history. For decades, the academic world was so in love with the idea of the masculine Viking hero that they literally erased the women standing right in front of them. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was something worse. It was a blind spot. A collective delusion that lasted until the modern age. We were so sure that war was a man's game that we refused to see the player who was beating us at our own logic. But cracks were starting to form in the theory. The bones were waiting for someone to stop looking at the sword and start looking at the DNA. For nearly a century, the skeleton of BJ581 lay in a museum box, labeled simply as a battle-hardened male. The world had moved on. The wars of the 20th century came and went. But in the quiet corners of academia, a new science was emerging. Archaeology was no longer just about digging up treasures. It was becoming forensic in the 1970s. Osteology, the study of bones, began to challenge the old assumptions. Bones are not just scaffolding for the body. They are a biography written in calcium. They tell us what a person ate, how hard they worked, and, crucially, who they were biologically. When a new generation of researchers looked at the drawings and the remains of the Birka Warrior, they noticed something the Jorma Stolp had ignored. The human skeleton has distinct sexual dimorphism. The most obvious indicator is the pelvic girdle. A female pelvis is shaped by evolution for childbirth. It is wider, more circular. A male pelvis is narrower, more heart-shaped. When the osteologists looked at the drawings of BJ581, they didn't see the narrow hips of a man. They saw the wide open structure of a woman. They looked at the mandible, the jawbone. It lacked the heavy, square density usually found in male warriors. It was slender. Whispers began to circulate in the university halls of Stockholm. "Have you looked at the bones?" they asked. "They don't match the sword." But these whispers were quickly silenced by the roar of tradition. The establishment pushed back. They argued that bones can shrink over 1,000 years. They argued that maybe this was a gracile man, a warrior with a slight build. Or, in the most patronizing theory of all, they suggested that perhaps the skeleton was female, but she wasn't the warrior. They theorized she was simply the wife of a warrior, buried with his equipment as a sign of respect, or that the real warrior's body had decayed completely, leaving only her behind. They invented ghosts to explain away the reality. The cognitive dissonance was powerful. The experts could not reconcile the female bones with the male job description. So, for another 40 years, the doubt remained just a footnote. The skeleton stayed in the box. The museum label stayed the same. The lie continued. It would take the technological revolution of the 21st century to finally give her a voice that could not be shouted down. Asterisk, asterisk, we arrive now at the turning point. The year is 2017. The place is Stockholm University. A team of geneticists and archaeologists, led by Charlotte Hedenstad Notensen, decided it was time to end the debate once and for all. They weren't going to rely on the shape of a hip bone or the interpretation of a rusted sword. They were going to look at the source code. They extracted a sample from the ancient remains, perhaps from a canine tooth or the dense petrous bone of the inner ear, where DNA can survive the ravages of time. Inside those cells, preserved against the odds for over a millennium, was the genomic truth of the Birka Warrior. The process of ancient DNA analysis is delicate. It is a conversation with the dead on a molecular level. They were looking for the sex chromosomes. In humans, the biological sex is determined by the X and Y chromosomes. A man carries an X and a Y. A woman carries two X's. If they found even a trace of a Y chromosome, the traditionalists would be vindicated. The skeleton would be a man, and the wide hips would just be an anomaly. But as the data came back from the sequencer, the result was unambiguous. It was stark. It was undeniable. There was no Y chromosome, none. The readout showed two X chromosomes. The sample also proved she had no male relatives buried in the grave with her. It was just her. The team checked the results again and again. The science was absolute. The person buried in the most elaborate, militaristic grave of the Viking Age. The person surrounded by armor-piercing arrows and strategy games. The person revered for a century as the ultimate Viking man was biologically female. This was not a theory. This was not a feminist reinterpretation of history. This was hard, cold data. The king of Birka was a queen. The implications were explosive. It meant that the stories of the Valkyries were not just drunk fantasies told in mead halls. It meant that the Shield Maiden, the woman who fights alongside men, was not a myth. She was real. She walked the earth. She commanded troops, and she was buried with the highest honors her people could bestow. In that laboratory in Stockholm, the iron ceiling of history didn't just crack, it shattered. The DNA proved that in the Viking world, the role of a warrior was not defined by what was between your legs, but by the steel in your hand and the fire in your heart. But as the team prepared to publish their findings, they expected surprise. They expected excitement. What they did not expect was the rage that was about to come their way. We arrive now at the turning point. The moment where history stops being a guessing game and becomes a hard science. The year is 2017. The location is the Paleogenetics Laboratory at Stockholm University. For decades, the debate about the Birka Warrior had been fought with opinions. "I think the hips look wide," said one expert. "I think the bones shrank," argued another. It was subjective. It was messy. But Charlotte Hedenstad Notensen, the lead archaeologist on the new study, was done with opinions. She wanted facts. And to get facts from a skeleton that has been dissolving in the soil for 1,000 years, you don't use a magnifying glass. You use a sequencer. The team turned to a technology known as next-generation sequencing. This isn't just looking at blood type. This is reading the shattered, fragmented library of a human being's genetic code. The process is incredibly delicate. Ancient DNA is not like modern DNA. It is damaged. It is broken into tiny pieces. It is contaminated by centuries of bacteria, fungus, and the touch of every archaeologist who handled the bones since 1878 to find the truth. The geneticists had to drill. They took a sample from the left canine tooth and the humerus arm bone. Why the tooth? Because the enamel acts like a time capsule, sealing the DNA inside, protecting it from the outside world. Inside the sterile environment of the clean room, dressed in full protective suits to avoid contaminating the sample with their own skin cells, they extracted the powder. They dissolved the bone. They purified the genetic material they were looking for to specific things. First, the biological sex. In mammals, this is determined by the chromosomes. A male has an X and a Y. A woman has two X's. If the Birka Warrior was a man, the machine would light up with white chromosomal reads. If there was even a trace of a Y, the traditionalists would be right. Second, they looked at strontium isotopes. This is a chemical signature locked in the teeth that tells us where a person grew up. It tells us if they were a local or if they were a traveler. The computer crunched the data. Millions of DNA fragments were aligned against the human genome. And when the results finally appeared on the screen, the silence in the room was heavy. The Y chromosome ... was missing. It wasn't that the data was poor. The data was excellent. The X chromosome reads were high. The genetic coverage was sufficient. There was simply no Y to be found. The result was unambiguous. XX. The person buried with the sword. The person buried with the tactical game board. The person buried with the sacrificed horses was biologically female. And the strontium analysis added another layer to the story. It proved that she was not a local. She had not grown up in Birka. She had traveled from somewhere else, likely from southern Scandinavia or perhaps further west. This destroyed the argument that she was just a local wife buried with her husband's gear. She was a migrant, a wanderer, a woman of the world who had moved across the Viking map, carrying her weapons with her. This was the smoking gun. The DNA didn't just suggest she was female. It proved she had no male relatives in the grave. It proved she wasn't suffering from some rare genetic disorder that mimics male traits. She was a healthy, mobile, biological woman. In that moment, the iron ceiling of history shattered. The DNA proved that the archetype of the Viking warlord, the bearded giant we see in every movie and video game, was a lie. Or at least, only half the truth. The Valkyries were not just myths invented by drunk poets. They were real. They walked the earth. They bled. They commanded. But science is a double-edged sword. It gives you the truth, but it doesn't guarantee that people will accept it. As the team prepared to publish their paper in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, they felt a sense of victory. They had solved a century-old cold case. They expected the world to be fascinated. They expected headlines celebrating the discovery. What they did not expect was the hate. They were about to learn that, for some people, protecting the fantasy of the past is more important than accepting the reality of the evidence. The storm was coming. When the study was published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, the team expected debate. That is how science works. You present data, and colleagues review it. But what happened next was not a polite academic discussion. It was an explosion. The internet lit up. Comment sections on news sites turned into battlegrounds. But the most surprising reaction didn't come from anonymous trolls. It came from fellow historians, archaeologists, and scholars. Instead of accepting the DNA evidence, a significant portion of the academic community went into a state of absolute denial. They simply refused to believe it. The arguments they invented to discredit the findings were a masterclass in mental gymnastics. First, they attacked the competence of the original excavation. The bones must have been mixed up, they cried. They suggested that Hjalmar Stolp, one of the most meticulous excavators of the 19th century, had accidentally swapped the bones of a random woman with the bones of the warrior in the museum's storage. The research team went back and checked the records. Every bag was labeled correctly. The spine was intact. The context was preserved. The mix-up theory was a desperate attempt to blame human error for a result. They didn't like that. Then came the invisible man theory. This was perhaps the most absurd argument of all. Critics suggested that there must have been a man in the grave, the real warrior, but that his body had decomposed completely, leaving zero trace, while the woman's skeleton next to him remained perfectly preserved. Think about the logic of that. They were willing to invent a ghost, a magical, disappearing man, rather than accept that the woman sitting right there, surrounded by weapons, was the owner of the grave. Then came the symbolic argument. Okay, they conceded, maybe it is her grave, but the weapons aren't hers. She was buried with her husband's sword as a sign of respect. Or maybe she was a priestess, and the weapons were just ceremonial symbols. This is where the double standard is exposed in its rawest form. In the history of archaeology, whenever we find a male skeleton with a sword, we say, he was a warrior. We never ask, was he holding that sword for his wife? We never ask, was it ceremonial? We look at the gear, we look at the man, and we connect the dots. But the moment the skeleton is female, the connection is broken. Suddenly, the sword becomes a symbol. The shield becomes a decoration. The horse becomes a pet. Why is the bar for proof so much higher for a woman? If this skeleton had a Y chromosome, the debate would have ended in seconds. No one would have questioned the bones. No one would have invented invisible husbands. The artifact assemblage in BJ581 is the definition of a warrior's kit. It is functional. It is deadly. It is not jewelry. The backlash revealed something uncomfortable about our modern view of the Vikings. We have romanticized them as the ultimate hypermasculine society. We want them to be bearded giants protecting their fragile women, when science tells us that the reality was more complex, that gender roles were fluid, and that ability mattered more than anatomy. It threatens the fantasy. The critics demanded more proof. They said biology wasn't enough. They said, just because she has a sword doesn't mean she knew how to use it. But the grave had an answer for that too, because buried alongside the steel was something even more dangerous than a weapon. Something that proves she wasn't just a foot soldier following orders. She was the one giving them. It was time to look at the board game, Asterisk. Asterisk, the critics tried to argue that even if she was biological female, perhaps she was just a symbolic figurehead. Maybe she held the sword, but didn't know how to swing it. But Grave BJ581 held one final secret that makes that argument impossible. Resting on her lap, buried with the same care as her weapons, was a pouch containing gaming pieces. A full set for the Viking board game, HNEFATAFL, to the modern eye. This looks like a toy. A pastime to kill hours on a long voyage. But to a historian of warfare, this is a badge of rank. Henefetef, often called Viking chess, is not a game of luck. It does not use dice. It is a game of pure strategy. It simulates a siege. You have a king piece in the center, surrounded by defenders. and they are being swarmed by attackers from the edges. To win, you need to understand flanking, sacrifice, defensive lines, and the geometry of battle. In the Viking Age, skill at Hennefertoft was synonymous with skill in war. It was part of the education of a noble. It was how commanders sharpened their minds before the real blood was spilled. Finding a complete set of these pieces in a grave is extremely rare. And when we do find them, they are almost exclusively in the graves of high-ranking officers, men who led armies, men who stood on the hill and directed the shield wall. The presence of this game in BJ581 changes the profile of the woman buried there. It tells us she wasn't just a grunt. She wasn't just a foot soldier who picked up an axe in desperation. She was a tactician. She was a leader. This grave belonged to someone who planned raids, someone who understood the logistics of moving troops, someone whose authority was respected enough to be buried with the symbols of command. This destroys the wife theory completely. You do not bury a housewife with a tactical simulator. You do not bury a priestess with a game designed to teach military maneuvering. You bury a general with these tools, and this aligns with the physical evidence of the bones. The analysis showed no signs of hard, repetitive domestic labor, no washerwoman's spine. But the muscle attachment points on the bones were developed, consistent with archery and sword training. She was physically fit, well-nourished, and intellectually equipped to lead. So, we are left with a new picture. Not a mythical Valkyrie flying in the clouds, but a real, flesh and blood woman, standing on the deck of a longship, checking the wind, ordering the course, watching the horizon with the cold calculation of a veteran commander. She didn't just break the glass ceiling of her time. She stood on top of it, sword in hand. But if she existed, surely there must be stories about her. Surely a woman of this power wouldn't be forgotten by her own people. The truth is, she wasn't forgotten. We just stopped listening to the stories. The sagas told us about women like her for centuries. We just thought they were fairy tales. It is time to reread the myths. Asterisk science has finally caught up with history. The DNA analysis of BJ581 gave us the physical proof, but the cultural proof was hiding in plain sight for 1,000 years. We just chose not to read it. For centuries, historians treated the Norse sagas with extreme skepticism. They viewed them as fantasy, novels, entertaining stories about dragons, trolls, and magic swords. And whenever the sagas mentioned women fighting, the academics rolled their eyes. They dismissed figures like the Skaldmør the Shield Maiden as literary devices, invented by poets to add a bit of romance or shock value to the tale. But look at the texts again through the lens of the Birka discovery. Take the saga of Herva. It tells the story of a woman who dresses as a man, commands a ship, and visits her father's ghostly burial mound to demand his cursed sword. She isn't a damsel in distress. She is the protagonist. She is a warlord. For years, scholars said Herva was a metaphor. Now, looking at the bones of BJ581, Herva looks a lot less like a metaphor and a lot more like a biography. Then there is the most famous of them all, Lagertha, recorded by the Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus in the 12th century. Lagertha was described as a skilled warrior who, quote, bore a man's temper in a woman's body. Saxo writes that in the Battle of Lania, the victory was due to the women who fought on the front lines. He wrote, they offered war rather than kisses. Victorian historians read this and laughed. They called it absurdity. They said Saxo was just trying to make the Vikings look barbaric by showing their women acting against nature. But the grave at Birka tells us that Saxo wasn't making it up. He was reporting the news. And what about the Valkyries? In mythology, they are supernatural beings, the choosers of the slain, who fly over the battlefield and decide who lives and who dies. We always pictured them as angels of death, purely magical. But think about the woman in Grave BJ581. She was a high-ranking commander. She stood on the hill. She directed the troops. She literally chose who would be sent into the meat grinder of the shield wall and who would be held back. To a terrified soldier looking up at the commander's ridge, seeing a woman in armor pointing her sword and deciding his fate. Is she not a Valkyrie? Perhaps the myth wasn't an invention. Perhaps it was just an exaggeration of the real. Women who held the power of life and death in their hands. The skepticism of the modern era blinded us. We assumed that because our women didn't fight in the 1800s or 1900s, Viking women couldn't have fought in the 900s. We projected our own fragility onto them. But the Viking world was pragmatic. If you could swing a sword, you were useful. If you could lead a raid, you were followed. The sagas were telling us the truth the whole time. We just weren't ready to listen. But BJ581 is not an anomaly. She is not a unicorn. Now that we know what to look for, we are finding them everywhere. The ghost of the Shield Maiden is rising from the earth all across Scandinavia. Asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 9. Beyond Birka, the most common argument used to dismiss the Birka Warrior was the unicorn theory. Critics said, fine, maybe this one woman was a warrior, but she was an anomaly, a freak of nature, a unicorn. They tried to contain the damage, to keep the rest of history safe from revision. But once you learn how to spot a lie, you start seeing the truth everywhere. The discovery of BJ581 didn't just rewrite the story of one grave. It forced us to reopen the files on thousands of others. It started a chain reaction across the archaeological world. Museums began dusting off boxes that hadn't been opened since the 1900s. And guess what they found? The Birka Warrior wasn't alone. Look at the Oseberg ship in Norway. It is the richest, most magnificent Viking burial ever discovered. A massive longship, beautifully carved, filled with tapestries, sleighs, and precious metals. For years, we focused on the ship. But inside that ship were the skeletons of two women, no men. Just two women sent to the afterlife with the wealth of an emperor. For decades, historians called them queens or sorceresses, refusing to use the word commander. But they wielded power on a scale that most Viking kings could only dream of. Then, look at the grave in Sola, Norway. For years, it was assumed to be a man's grave because of the weapons. But new technology reconstructed the skull. Not only was it female, but the skull had a massive defect, a terrifying gash in the forehead caused by a sword. This wasn't a woman who died in childbirth. This wasn't a woman who died weaving. This was a woman who took a sword to the face in the heat of combat. The wound had shown signs of healing, meaning she survived the blow and lived to fight another day. She was a veteran, and recently, in Finland, the grave of Swantaka has challenged us even further. Buried with a sword, the DNA analysis suggested an individual with XXY chromosomes Klinefelter syndrome, a person who biologically defied the binary gender norms of the time, yet was respected and armed as a high-status warrior. The unicorn theory is dead. BJ581 was not an anomaly. She was simply the first one we caught. The problem wasn't that female warriors were rare. The problem was that for centuries, Whenever we found a skeleton with a sword, we checked the mailbox on the form without looking at the bones. We classified them by their tools, not their biology. Now that the blindfold has been removed, the landscape of the Viking Age looks different. It is more diverse. It is more complex. It is a world where power was seized by those strong enough to take it, regardless of gender. The army of ghosts is speaking, and they are telling us that the shield wall was never a men-only club. We are only at the beginning of this new understanding. How many other kings in our museums are actually queens? How many other histories need to be rewritten? The Birka Warrior opened the door. Now, we just have to be brave enough to walk through it. The grave on the hill in Birka is quiet now. The excavation is closed. The bones of BJ581 rest in a museum in Stockholm, behind glass, protected by alarms and climate control. But the silence she left behind is louder than the noise of any battle. For 130 years, she was a prisoner of our expectations. We looked at her and saw what we wanted to see. A man, a hero, a patriarch. We stripped her of her identity and forced her into a costume that didn't fit. But she waited. The truth waited in the calcium of her teeth and the curve of her hips, patient and enduring, until we finally built the technology and the courage to hear her speak. The story of the Birka Warrior is not just a story about Vikings. It is a warning to us. It is a reminder that history is not a static list of facts carved in stone. History is a fluid, living thing. It changes as we change. It grows as we grow. Every time we look back at the past, we are looking through the lens of our own time. And sometimes that lens is dirty. By proving that a woman could hold the highest military rank in Viking society, BJ581 didn't just reclaim her own sword. She reclaimed the history of half the human race. She forced us to admit that capability has no gender. She forced us to accept that the past was stranger, wilder, and more diverse than our Victorian ancestors could ever imagine today. When a child opens a history book and reads about the Vikings, the picture is starting to look different. They might see a picture of the Birka reconstruction, a woman with a scar on her face, holding a bow, commanding a ship. That child will grow up knowing a truth that we were denied. They will know that a warrior can look like anyone, but the work is not done. The Birka Warrior was the first domino to fall, but she will not be the last. As we speak, laboratories around the world are grinding up ancient bone dust, testing samples from graves in England, Russia, and Iceland. We are re-asking the fundamental questions. What else have we missed? What other kings were actually queens? What other myths were actually memories? The iron ceiling has been shattered. The ghosts are free. And as we look back at the Viking Age, the mist is finally clearing. We can see them now, standing on the prow of the ships, not as the stereotypes we invented, but as the people they truly were. She was a commander. She was a strategist. She was a traveler. And she was a woman. Science proved it. History forgot it. But now, thanks to the code of life hidden in her bones, we will remember her forever. This has been the Viking Saga. Thank you for watching.